You still there, Steve?
I'm still there, Lillian. Do you want me to share my camera?
Yeah, you can.
All right, there we go. All right, there we go. Anyway, how are you doing, Lillian?
Good. Yourself?
Oh, I'm good. We're doing this on a Friday, which is good. So Fridays are always good before the weekend.
Thank you for coming.
No, thanks for the invite. So I believe today's just about sharing some kind of commercial knowledge around the commercial market in Australia.
Exactly. I think a lot of members, most of our members, they are, I guess they are very familiar with residential property, but commercial property is like an area where most people want to know, but not very comfortable. Yeah, but very curious on how to utilize it well to build the property portfolio better and make money faster, I guess. So it would be good if you can share some of your insight and help our group member understand about commercial property more.
Okay, that's fine. So are you happy just for me to chat for a little bit? I can give a kind of quick 5-10 minute run through of commercial property.
Yeah, wonderful. Take it away.
Okay, all right. So commercial property is generally just any property where the primary use is making a profit at the actual location. So the tenant's job is to make a profit. So that's why you can still have a residential property that's a commercial property. So an example would be like the local GP clinic, which is done out of a normal house. That is a commercial property zoned for commercial because the tenant in there is there to make a profit. So that's why it's commercial property. There's obviously more types with commercial. So you've got industrial, office space, retail. Then you've got specialized, which is like cinemas and car wash stations and things like that. So there's a lot more to it. But then there's also a lot more to like doing the due diligence and understanding it and things like that. Even there's quite a lot of misconceptions. So the biggest misconceptions probably for your listeners and why most people don't invest in it. The first one is they'll say that it's too high risk. They'll say, oh no, if you lose your tenant, it's for a longer period. It is a little bit, but not if you know what you're doing. So if you know what you're doing, you can mitigate the risk. So like industrial vacancy rates at the moment, they're sub 0.5% in every capital city. So even though you might lose your tenant for 1 or 2 or 3 months, you get the tenant on average for 10 to 15 years. So that's no real difference to a residential where the vacancy rate might be 1 or 2 weeks every couple of years. It ends up being the same net result. So that's the first misconception. The other one is you need a lot of money to get involved into it. So you need to have like hundreds of millions of dollars to buy a Westfield shopping centre. You don't have to buy that type. You can buy little warehouses in Brisbane and Sydney for 300 grand, or you could buy a warehouse for 15 mil. And then there's the whole spectrum of the type of tenants. You can have the little Joe's Electrical Services warehouse. You can have the Bunnings on the other end. Then you've got versatility, you've got multi-tenancy, then you've got freestanding. So that's what confuses most people. There's just so many types, different things. I've actually got like a 300-page book on commercial investing, which is like kind of goes through pros and cons. But the main benefit of commercial is the cash flow. You still get the same capital growth, assuming you buy something with a land component. So industrial and retail will have the same capital growth. Office space, not necessarily as much, but it depends where you buy because that you're more buying airspace. Similar to sort of like a off-the-plan high-density apartment, that might not have the same capital growth as a house. So that's something to be mindful of there. But the cash flow is generally 3 times that of a residential. So to put it in perspective, on a commercial, you may say get a 6% net yield. That's net, whereas residential's gross. So where you might buy a Sydney property for a 3.5 or 4% gross yield, you still have to pay council rates, water rates, maintenance, insurance. Commercial, it's a net yield because you don't pay any of that. The tenant pays that. So 3.5, 4% gross yielding residentials actually ends up being about a 2% net yield. Commercial, you're getting 6. So you're getting 3 times as much net return on a commercial. And that's why people buy it. It actually builds a passive income. And I can show you in some spreadsheets with the cash flow, what it looks like if you like, Lillian.
Sure. Steve, would you be able to also explain, because initially I felt like, commercial property, 5 to 7% net yield, very, very good. But then if you think about commercial lending rate, which is also even higher than residential lending interest rate. So in the end, does it actually work out to be still very good?
Yeah, so that will erode the cash return a little bit, but it's not significant enough to do this. So generally, interest rates are about 1% higher for commercial than they are to residential. So the cash flow still makes an incredible amount of sense. So in saying that, like I said, instead of it being 2% to 6%, you could theoretically say it's a 5% to a 2%. So you're still 2.5 times. So the cash flow is still quite strong. The general thing with lending is it's a bit different as well. So you've still got your standard full doc loans. So you've got your 15, 20, 25, 30-year loans, interest only, principal plus interest, all that type of stuff. Where commercial really can kind of shine as well is there's things called lease doc loans. So that's a loan based on the strength of the lease. So if you've got a 5-year lease, the banks will give you a 5-year loan based on the serviceability of that lease in itself. So where residential investors might be running into some trouble with kind of finance where they don't have the serviceability, commercial means you can actually keep going because the rent from the commercial is obviously much higher. So that's going to help your serviceability. But then you've also got those no doc and lease doc loans to keep moving forward. Then it just depends on like the client's dependent. Like if you're pulling out the money from a residential property to buy a commercial, then you're theoretically going to have a residential rate. If you're just buying a commercial by itself with your cash finances, you'll generally need a 30% deposit. So there are a few lenders at the moment doing 80% loans. So ANZ, Suncorp, BOQ, Liberty, they're all offering 80% lends at the moment, which is quite strong. And then interest rates are kind of in that kind of 6 to 7% for those. But again, it just depends on personal circumstances of like what your finances look like, what structures you're buying under, what your serviceability is, what you're trying to achieve with your property as well, and over what time frame. So commercial is good if you're trying to build a passive income quickly. And I'll show some spreadsheets later and some forecasting, and that'll give you a bit of an idea around it, Lillian.
Sure. You mentioned about the 30% deposit. I just wondering, instead of providing that as cash, can like for commercial lending, is it okay to provide 30% from equity of residential property, or that's not possible?
No, definitely possible. So that's how I've grown my portfolio. So that's I always pull equity from other properties to use in my deposit. Where that hurts your cash flow is obviously because you've got 100% debt, because you've got 70% loan with one lender and then you're paying the interest on 30% from another lender. So that's going to erode the cash flow a little bit. But weirdly enough, even with commercial, because let's just say I got a 6.5% net yield and the interest rate was 6.5%, that property is still cash flow neutral. I'm not negative. If you went and did that on a residential property on a 4% gross yield and you had 100% debt, that property is about 20, again, for like $1 million property, you're about 20, 30 grand a year negative. So the commercial's neutral to positive, the residential is really negative. But no, same concept with growing a residential portfolio. You grow, you use the capital growth plus your additional savings plus the cash flow that you've accumulated, and you use that for the deposit. The next one, I've got a property plan. I'll show you guys where kind of how it shows how it falls out.
Wonderful. I think I think maybe get you to show us your slides so it's easier for us to comprehend with all the numbers.
Yep. Okay, that's fine. So let's.
Thank you.
I'll share my whole screen now, and then I'll go back to the window just so it's you can see a little bit easier. But I need this for the spreadsheet. Let's just go commercial cash flow calculator first. That's probably a nice one to show you. All right, so let's just say $1 million property. I'll keep the numbers nice and round, so that way if you want to buy 10 million, you times it by 10. If you want to buy a 500K one, you divide it by 2. Let's just go say 6% net return. Depreciation, you actually get a high depreciation from most commercial properties because the construction costs are quite high. So that's quite strong, but I'll leave that as 0 just to be conservative. And then rental management is generally between 2 and 7%, depending on kind of the value of the commercial. Property managers generally want to get kind of like $5 grand-ish a year to manage a property. Capital gains, I can assume that whatever, that's more for forecasting, but this is just to show you, put in perspective. So say we buy a $1 million property on a 6% net return, and we're getting 5.5% interest rate. So basically what the cash flow is going to look like is the tenant's going to pay you $60,000. You need to pay the mortgage on the property. So that's going to be the interest. So that's $38,500. Then you've got rental management, which is like $2 to $5 grand, like I mentioned before. And then what's left over is your cash return. So for a $1 million property on a 5.5% interest rate, that's about a 20 grand a year passive income. So that's where the power of commercial is. When interest rates drop, then it becomes quite attractive that way. They go up. If interest rates keep going up, then it kind of diminishes down to like a 10 grand-ish. You mentioned before as well about the 100%. So like pulling the equity from somewhere else, that's theoretically 100% loan. So that's why you can see we're going closer to neutral there.
Yes.
And that's what I will show you though, so this is probably my light bulb moment for commercial. So when I created this spreadsheet, it was my kind of like, oh wow, there's something powerful about this. So let's just keep the numbers the same. Let's say a $1 million property on let's go 6.5% net return and 7 grand. Yep. So cost, extra payment. All right. So say with the property, you put the cash flow back into the actual debt. So this is a 70% LVR. So that's why the cash flow is quite high. If you put the cash flow back into the actual debt, it actually pays itself off in about 10 years. And then in 10 years' time, with rental increases, and I can make this rental increase whatever, we can say 5% if we want to be really conservative. In 10 years' time, you've got $100,000 passive income with no debt on the property. To get $100,000 passive income on residential, it's normally a 25, 30-year process to pay down the debt, and you need about a 3 mil portfolio. And we're doing it in a third the time with the third property. And again, I'm not trying to sugarcoat it for your listeners. Like, there are risks with commercial. You need much bigger deposits. If you don't know what you're doing, you can buy an absolute dud property and it sit there vacant for a long time. So this is where like my services and that come is to make sure people don't make a mistake. But if you get it right, it's an absolute game changer. Like you can generally create passive incomes and kind of move forward that way.
Steve, sorry, just on this slide, I noticed you have the loan rate down as 2.5%.
Okay, sorry, I'll change it. Sorry. Yeah,
but I'm just wondering, what's the loan rate at the moment? Like, you know, if we put in the current loan rate, are we going to be still ahead or what?
This extends the time period. So if you change the loan rate, it makes it go from 10 years to like 13 years, for instance. What I've actually been conservative on is the rental increases, though I'm being quite low. Like inflation's at 7.8%. So theoretically, we should be having 7-8%. What's actually happened in this market, because interest rates have gone up, rents have grown considerably with commercial. So in the last year, industrial rents went up on average 20 to 30%. So that's why, and again, it's sort of like residential. Nothing is perfectly linear. Like we had, like getting a property 5 years ago, having fixed 3 to 5% interest rates was a really strong lease because inflation was quite low. Now it's actually the opposite. People want CPI increases because they're at 7-8%. And then that changes as well. So if I do like 8%, that brings it back a couple of years. So these spreadsheet is fluid. It depends on what happens. Obviously, if interest rates come down or the rental increases go up or it all stays the same, it's just illustrative. But whether or not it be you pay it off in 8 years or 13 years, the concept's still there of you're building a passive income over a 10, 15-year period. And then that's the powerful thing there. What I'll actually show you is I'll show you a 100K plan of how it kind of, and these are just general figures that I actually did. I think I chose a 5% interest rate because it's a 30-year average. This is how you grow a commercial portfolio. So if you don't just want to buy the one and pay it off within 10 years, if you want to keep accumulating, this is the general process. So this is actually quite good. The numbers are pretty similar, 6% net yield, 5% rate. I've got additional contributions. So that's like if someone just wants to put additional savings into the portfolio, because most people that are aggressive and trying to build a portfolio, they usually are saving money as well. Like they're saving money, or it might be a self-managed super fund where you're putting 30 grand into your self-managed super fund. But most people accumulate based on cash flow of their portfolio, additional contributions, and equity. So I've been really conservative in the equity here. I've just done the equity based on 3% rental increases. So to keep the cap rate, 3% capital growth. And then this just shows. So you'll have like $1 million property, get around 25 grand a year passive income from that property with a 5% interest rate. If you then have 30 grand a year additionally that you can save, in 3 years' time, you'll have $90,000 saved. You'll have accumulated $80,000 equity, $80,000 cash flow, and you'll have about 60 grand of equity further grown. So then what happens is, okay, cool. To buy property number 2, you'll then pull out 70% of that equity. You'll use the 90,000 and you'll use the $80,000 cash flow that you've saved, and that'll give you a deposit for number 2. And then same process. Obviously, as your portfolio starts getting bigger, the equity amount grows larger and the cash flow is larger. So then you can start stepping up in size and things like that. And like I said, this isn't a fixed plan. Like you could get one in the first 2 years and buy something smaller, or you could wait 5 years and buy something larger, or you could put less contributions and it'll take a bit longer, or you could put more contributions and you'll get there quicker. So it's just a general plan. Any of your listeners, if you want me to kind of mock up one of these plans for you, just shoot me an email. They take me 2 minutes to quickly kind of forecast. So I'm happy to do that for free of charge for you. And then you just start building that way. So this one, I showed you the one where we pay it down and get about 100 grand passive income. This one, in 10 years' time, we've still only got 100 grand passive income. But what happens is, instead of having a 1 mil portfolio, we've got a 4.2 mil portfolio, which means we're going to have more future wealth. Because if this portfolio grows by 10%, the $1 million one previously you would have only made 100 grand. Now you're making $425,000 passive income. So $425,000 equity there. If the rents grow by 5%, you're then maximizing that return. So this will look much better in 20 years' time than the previous one property that I showed you. So even though it's the same cash flow, it's more future wealth. So that's the kind of balance there that you can kind of go through. But did that make sense, Lynn?
Just the question, additional contribution, is that like your own saving that you put in to pay down the portfolio? Oh, okay.
It's not so much to pay down. Well, you theoretically could pay down then refinance, but for me, like I'd always say, look, keep the money in an offset account because I'd rather have control of it over the banks anyway. I've just put that in because most people trying to do a 10-year strategy and buy multiple properties have some form of savings. They've normally got a good income because that's the whole reason they got into property in the first place, and they're going there. It also kind of resembles a self-managed super fund as well. So someone who kind of earns their 300 grand a year, they might have 30 grand super going in. That would be the super contributions per year. So I've tried to choose the most generic case I've seen from all my clients. Like I've done 1,500 plus deals now. This is a very stock standard like one. People can save kind of 15 to 30 grand a year. The interest rates on average are 5%. I've been conservative with rental increases. I chose $1 million because it's a very easy number to double. If you've got a 2 mil budget, cool. You end up with a 200 grand and a 8 mil portfolio. If you've only got a $500,000 budget, cool, you end up with a 2 mil portfolio and a 50 grand passive income. So I've just tried to choose some round numbers. I can change all these numbers. Like I said, it's just illustrative. There's nothing special or complicated going on. It's very simple of cash flow plus equity plus additional contributions, using that as a deposit for the next deal, then so forth. There's no tricks or games behind this spreadsheet. It's a very simple spreadsheet.
So I noticed in year 4, that's when property number 2 was introduced. So can you explain like how property number 2 got the 30% deposit? Like, is it from the additional contribution plus capital growth plus something else?
Yep, spot on. So we basically, it's accumulated cash flow because each year that property was about 25 grand a year cash flow. So you can see like by year 2, we've got 50 grand because it's 25 grand plus 25 grand. And that's also going up by 3%. That's why it's a little bit different. Then plus now, because the rents have gone up and it'll be like 28 grand cash flow, we're at $80,000 worth of savings that we've got from the cash flow. Plus the additional contributions. So that's the 30 grand each year that you're putting back into the investment portfolio. So that's 90 grand. Then we had conservatively 60 grand equity. So that's just 3% capital growth on $1 million portfolios. You see how it goes. The value goes from $1 million to $1 mil 40 to $1 mil 60. And then we pull out 70% of that. So we pull out 70% of 60,000 because we want to keep the LVR at 70%. If we were going with one of the lenders I mentioned before with 80%, we'd pull out 80% of that and then go there. So we're using 70% of that plus the additional contributions, plus the savings of cash flow that we have, which is the 213 grand, which we then use as a 30% deposit on the 600 grand property that we buy number 2.
Okay.
And as I mentioned before, we could wait another couple of years and that number would be more like 300 grand and we could jump straight into like a higher priced one. We could jump into like an 800K one. It's fluid. It depends on the client, like what they're trying to achieve over what time frame versus what they've actually got to work with in terms of borrowing capacity, serviceability, savings, equity in the other portfolio and all that type of stuff as well. And that's why there's no like cookie cutter kind of solution for everyone. You have to look at the circumstances and then go from then. One of the examples I'll use is like if I had a client that approached me and they're a young 22-year-old client and they don't own any properties, I'm probably not going to recommend commercial property because they're going to get better maximizing their loan to value ratio with residential. So I would much rather them go out and buy $3 million properties with 90% loans and then one commercial on a 70% because they're going to have a portfolio that's 3 times as large and they're young enough that they're not planning to retire anytime soon. They're going to work. They're going to work for the next 10 years plus. So while they've got this serviceability, let's maximize leveraging. The whole benefit of property is you get to play with someone else's money. Like that's the main benefit over shares. No share is going to give you 90% loan on the money. So you get to you get to play with big numbers. So that's where I wouldn't recommend commercial. But if I had a 65-year-old client come to me, buying a negatively geared residential doesn't help with their retirement because they don't want an asset that costs them money. They need to look at high cash flow. And it might not necessarily be a commercial. It could be a dual income, like a duplex or a house and granny flat or a high-yielding block of apartments or a regional town residential property, something with a cash flow so they can actually enjoy their retirement, or which is my forte, commercial. Like you come to me with commercial, if you've got a fair bit of cash for retirement, like if you've got, I don't know, let's just say you've got $1 million cash, we could say get a 50% LVR and buy $2 million worth of property. And it's going to be around an 80, 90 grand passive income over 2 assets. Like that's quite a strong way of doing it and low risk. You can buy things like entire shopping centers. So I bought a regional town a couple of months ago where we bought the entire shopping strip with 12 different tenants. That was 2.2 mil. And that was a 7.8% net return. So we got that for one of our retiree clients because that wasn't a capital growth play. That's purely let's get as much cash flow return as we can with as low risk as we can. So like it just depends on person dependent. So I'll come back to you.
I like the sound of that because I'm older. So I think commercial property will suit me.
But it just depends. You might be at the end of your serviceability as well. And you actually, if you want to keep progressing with your portfolio, you actually have to buy commercial anyway. You don't have any other choice. The other choice is wait there and try to get a lower LVR through capital growth, increase your income through your job, or wait for interest rates to come down. So like commercial does just offer another option, but ignoring that, if you can get the same capital growth with commercial property and you can mitigate the vacancy risk, what is the negative? You're winning on both fronts. You're getting capital growth, you're getting cash flow, you're winning there. But that's where commercial is a lot more work. So like, actually, I'll show you this. I'll present just to give people an idea of how much work's involved. So I'll share my screen. So just in terms of due diligence, there is about 20 times more work for a commercial. So this is just a sample. I just grabbed $1 million property that we've done recently. So this is just a little warehouse in Banyo, which is a suburb in Queensland, in Brisbane. There's normally a 60 to 80 page due diligence report we have to go through with the client. So because you have to do lease review, contract review, tenant interviews, foot and road traffic analysis, vacancy studies, occupancy studies, you need to interview the tenant, you need to do a credit history check on the tenant, you need to look at their profitability, competitor analysis, we check all their rental ledgers to make sure they pay on time, all their insurances. Like, this is not a game that you just want to go in and buy and hope for the best. Like, you need to cross-check everything to make sure, okay, does this property stack up, and go through all the, like I said, the competitors and zonings, and check where the easements are, check what future developments are going on, because you don't want to buy like a retail shop and then they open a Westfields 200 meters away and that kills the foot traffic. So you got to look at the future as well. And then you just got to go through everything, check the zonings. I'll go through this quick, otherwise I think we'll be here for an hour. Look at future value add possibility. Like residential is pretty simple. It's like, okay, do I subdivide? Do I add a granny flat, or do I build some townhouses or apartments? That's pretty much it. You've got the same with commercial. You can still do all those subdivisions, but then you've got additional things like splitting tenancies, adding telecommunications towers on tops, renovating, solar panels, changing the tenant, changing the use of the property, subdividing and creating new premises for the tenant. So you've got to do quite a lot of work. And you see here, this is a summary report of what we actually do. So just to kind of cross-check. And then we'll let the tenant, the client, know if we find anything. So I think from this one, I had a quick look. The mezzanine wasn't approved on it. Let me just double check. We interview the tenant as well. So we stalk them online. Then we actually have an interview and we record the interview. So that way the buyer knows, okay, are they staying there long term? What's business like? All that type of stuff.
Yes.
So on this one, the mezzanine wasn't approved. So in this situation, there'd be a couple options I'd run by the client. I'd actually say, look, we can try for some money off. So we can say, look, a mezzanine costs about 20, 30 grand to build. Let's try to get $40,000 off the purchase price and then get it approved ourselves. Luckily for my clients, I'm actually a chartered structural engineer. So I used to be an engineer in my previous life. So I can sort of look at this stuff and go, okay, it looks to trade standard. We should be all right. The other option is we could extend settlement and get the previous owner to get it approved before we settle, or we can crush the deal. If we find something that we're not happy with, we can just crush the deal. That's probably another thing worth talking about with the investors is commercial contracts are typically, unless you go to auction, are subject to due diligence. So you normally get like 2 to 3 weeks to do all these checks to make sure you're happy. If you find anything you're unhappy with, you crush the deal, you get your deposit back, you move on to the next one. But yeah, there's a bit more involved with that. Just got to cross-check insurances, and just doing like a vacancy study is tough. Like residential, you'll go on a website like SQM or something like that and look up vacancy rates. You need to do it manually with commercial. So you'll also call some property managers and say, hey, look, what's going on in the area? So I normally call 2 or 3 property managers, but then you'll just go through like Core Logic, for instance, and you'll have a look. So you can see how many examples we go through when we're cross-checking figures. But just for rent, we'll go through and actually find everything that like became available in the last year, what it rented for per square meter, what the details were, how many days it was on the market for, and then that'll give. So just to put in perspective, this warehouse, days on market, like if it goes vacant, 6 days, 9 days, 10 days, 7 days, 38 days, 37 days, 7 days, 7 days, 7 days, 7 days, like that's a really tightly held area. If you lose your tenant every 5-10 years and you have 2 or 3 weeks vacancy, that's not going to erode your net yield too much, which is quite nice. And that's why, like, I think I would have said on about a 1 to 3 month vacancy rate. 1 to 6 month typical vacancy period. So that's a really tightly held, strong area. So you've got all that type of stuff as well. So commercial, the rewards are there, but the work is also there. It's not just a simple browse on a Friday night on realestate.com and then put an offer in. Even before you put an offer, there's about 6 hours work.
Interesting.
Yeah, I know I rushed through quite a lot of heavy content there, so your listeners might have to go back and watch it a couple times, or alternatively, reach out. Like, I'm happy to have a chat with anyone. I've also got a podcast and about 1,000 videos on YouTube of educational ones going through how it all works and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So plenty of education there. We can set up a code if you want. So do you want to give the clients the book away for free? They just go to my website. Let me know what code you want, and they just go to the website code, and I'll send them a hard copy of the book for free.
Sure. Wonderful. And there were a few questions that the members wanted to ask last time. I don't know if you have it handy with you. Oh, okay. The first question is more around what's the entry price to purchase a quality commercial property? Like, I don't know. I've been told you need at least 700,000. Like, the purchase price needs to be like. Is that true? Like, do you have to spend that much to get into commercial property?
Yes and no. So you can still get into commercial quite cheap. I'd probably stay away from the really cheap ones, like where it's just like a storage shed or something like that, because that's very one-dimensional. You're only ever going to get a storage. That's probably going to have lack of capital growth. But you can buy little industrial warehouses in like Brisbane and Perth for a couple $100,000, and you can get some little retail shops and things like that. The negative with the really cheap ones is they're normally a smaller tenant. Like, you're not going to get a big established business. They're going to be like a sole trader or something like that, which comes with the risk of volatility, because most small businesses go one or two ways, Lillian. They either grow and they outgrow the space, or they close up shop because they fail at business. So they're more volatile in terms of you're not going to get a really long lease out of them. They're not going to sign a 5-year lease. They're going to sign a 12-month or 2-year type one. And they'll probably change locations every 5 years. So you're going to have a tenant on a 1-year or 2-year lease, and they're going to disappear every 5 years or so. The good thing is some of the vacancy rates on those small ones, because a lot of sole traders want them, like Sunshine Coast and Gold Coast, there's a 0% vacancy rate on those. They get filled straight away, but you pay property management fees releasing, and that erodes your yield a little bit. Whereas, like you mentioned, if you start moving up into the 700K price point, you just get more established businesses, ones that with like 5 to 15 staff. They're happy to sign the 3, 4, 5-year leases. So you get more quality in terms of that regard. Doesn't necessarily mean it's better. Like, I personally own quite a few sub 300K properties, and they've all done really well the last 4 years. They've all doubled minimum. They're all worth 600, 700K now. So you can still do really well, but it's the headaches with the tenant that get you. Then moving on to the question, the further you move up in price point, the more versatile and more variety of properties that you see. So if you start looking at the 2 million ones, you start looking at like freestanding sites, blue chip tenants, multi-tenancy. You start looking at more. Like, I'm under contract at the moment on a pet barn for 2.2 mil. So pet barn's like the pet store, like the freestanding building. They're on a 10-year lease. I think they've got 8 years left on the lease. You start looking at things like that as well. So you'll see more variety the higher price point you go, and get longer lease tenants. Then weirdly, there's a tipping point when you go ultra high net worth type stuff, because it's seen as such secure, yields actually come down. So if you go try to buy like a Woolworths or a Bunnings or something like that, you're not going to get a 6% net return. You're probably going to get like a 3% net return. Because that seems a much secure. But those individuals buying those aren't buying it necessary for the huge cash flow return. It's more of an inflation, parking your money play.
I see. Okay. I'll just check what's the next question. What level of net yield can commercial property achieve? I think we covered that earlier. Is it 5 to 7% net yield? Is that right?
That's a strong net yield. That you'll get that in like a Brisbane, Perth, picking a little bit up in Adelaide and Canberra at that. Sydney, I'm still buying some for like 5 to 5.5% in certain areas like Northern Beaches and Parramatta and areas like that. Sydney, Melbourne are probably a little bit lower in terms of it. So Melbourne, you're probably around that 4.5 to 5% is a good net yield. But again, it depends what you're buying, where you're buying. There's some stuff in Sydney, Melbourne you can buy on a 2% net yield. Whereas I look at it and go, well, why bother with the commercial when I can get the same return in residential? I'd rather buy residential and have more kind of flexibility there. So there's a full spectrum. And then I can get you a 10% net yield in a regional town in Australia if you want, but the vacancy rate will be much higher. So even though I might get you a 5-year lease, the vacancy period is not going to be 1 to 3 months like the one I showed you. It's going to be 1 to 3 years. So if you do have a vacancy, that's going to erode your return on investment anyway. So this is the harder part. And it's similar, you know, with residential, people have the capital growth versus cash flow argument that they say, oh, what's better, cash flow or capital growth? Yes. You've still got that. You've still got the same thing in commercial, but the cash flow is much higher. But I want to point out to the listeners, though, higher cash flow doesn't mean less capital growth. So buying a 5.5% yielding one in Sydney versus a 3% yielding one in Sydney doesn't mean the 3% yielding one's going to grow more. It might just have a more secure tenant, for instance.
Yes. Oh, okay. Yep. What other questions I have here? How to utilize commercial property loans to be able to keep borrowing and buy even more properties?
Yeah. Okay. So we've partially touched on that a couple of times. So the good thing is you got lease doc loans, and that's the real power play of how you keep moving forward, based with commercial, because it's not your personal circumstances that matter. It's the strength of the property itself. So that keeps moving forward. But what I also mentioned was, even if you are going like a full doc loan, a commercial, sometimes you have a better serviceability, because basically what the banks do when they look at your personal circumstances, before they lend you money, they look at whatever debt you have, your outgoings, how much you earn, how many dependents you have. Then they apply a stress test interest rate. So it's called shading. They'll generally add on, depend on the lender, 1.5 to 3.75% extra interest rate to what the current rate is. And then they'll see if you can afford that. So if you've got, let's just say, a neutrally geared residential portfolio. So you've bought fairly high cash flow, you've had it for a bit of a long time and the rents have come up, and you get a neutrally geared residential portfolio. When they apply that criteria, then it turns negative quite quickly in their eyes. So that $1 million portfolio might be like, okay, that costs you 40 grand a year to hold that with that shading. Whereas with commercial, if you had that $1 million property that was 25 grand a year positive, like I mentioned before, and they apply that criteria, that might be neutral or slightly negative. So it might even be 10 grand. So you might actually have some more capacity to keep moving forward with commercial, just from a serviceability point of view. And I've seen it all the time. I have people that come to me and they've got lots of equity in the residential, zero capacity with residential borrowing, but 1, 2, 3 mil commercial borrowing capacity because of that reason. This is also why you need to make sure you talk to a well-versed commercial broker, though. Don't just go to a resi broker and hope that they're going to get a deal done with a major bank. Commercial, there's way more moving parts. There's even commercial-only lenders, Lillian. So there's like one called Think Tank, which just does commercial lending. So a residential broker is not going to have them on their panel. So they're not even going to understand. So make sure that if you're talking to a broker, they're well-versed in commercial. They also need to have relationships. So it's a weird old school one where only like knowing people in the bank actually help. They'll call someone in ANZ and be like, cool, I've got this client, I need this. And then they'll work the magic behind the scenes to get it done. So they've got to have good networks and experiences as well.
I see. Sorry, the one you just mentioned, the name, what's the name of the?
Think Tank.
Think Tank. Okay. Interesting. All right. Yeah. I just wondering, like, I notice a lot of people, like when they have commercial property, like they build up like a very aggressive portfolio in a short time or something like that. I just wondering, do you have any real example of things that you have purchased in the past that done really well, or something that you can show us?
Yeah, that's fine. Let's just have a look. Maybe let's present. Actually, I'll go to my website. That's probably the easiest way. That way I don't have to open up emails and stuff. Let's wait for the screen to load. Can you see my screen? There we go. My social media team normally throw on about, I think it's about 4 or 5 a month. We do about 10 deals a month at the moment. They normally chuck about half of them on. Recent acquisitions. So like something like this. So how we were talking about 6 to 7% net yields. This one, we'll go this one. So this is a Liquorland. So this is a blue chip tenant in Perth. We got a slightly smaller yield because of the tenant. Like they've got refrigeration. It's actually a franchisee. So we've got like Liquorland, the head office owns the lease. So the guarantee is perfect. Like they're going to fill out the loan. The rent actually goes up and it becomes a 6.3% net anyway. But so that's just a circa $1 million property getting 6.3% in 1 month's time. There we go. Yeah, it just ticks the boxes that way. So you get stuff like that. Or if you got like slightly bigger budget, let me just find. You can buy brand new if you're looking for. So we got a brand new one with a brand new tenant for 1.9 mil. That benefit of this one will be depreciation. It'll be that we'll get about 30, 40 grand depreciation per year. So if that suits your circumstances and we have a chat with the accountant and that's right for you financially, that might be a good option. Here's just a warehouse we bought in Toowoomba. So Toowoomba's about an hour and a half, 2 hours from Brisbane CBD. So yes. we get a high yield because it's a slightly higher vacancy rate. So there it's about a 6 to 12 month vacancy rate, but instead of getting a 6.2% net yield, we're getting close to a 7.4% one. And this is actually a really good value add property as well. So part of the DD when we spoke to the tenant is they're locked into the location. So this tenant does like concrete. They're a concrete plant. They want a big pergola and they want to extend one of the buildings quite a lot as well. Actually, I can show you the plans 1 sec. Just let me quickly find it. I've actually got it because I was talking to the client a week ago about the plans. Let's find it quickly. Here we go. Let's see if it opens. All right, can you see that?
Yes.
So part of this plant, we're actually extending the building out and building like a pergola and all that type of stuff, which is actually going to increase. I'll go back to the actual property itself. Because we're going to get about $80,000 extra income from the tenant now because it's more floor space they can actually use, which is actually going to increase the value by 800 grand. So percentage wise, 2.6 mil plus 800 grand, and we're going to have to spend about 200 grand on it. Not a bad return on investment. So you get stuff like that as well. So this is a good one where it's freestanding. It's a really long-term tenant. It's a strong business, like concrete's not going anywhere, and we did competition analysis, but it's also got value add potential that we're working with the client, with the tenant over as well. So you can get stuff like that. I'll try to find something a little bit more variety for you.
But I'm just wondering, concrete business, like if this current tenant happen to leave, then potentially it can be very difficult to find another concrete business to come in.
So that's actually what I thought. And then we actually spoke with other concreters in the area. Part of the due diligence was we actually called Wholesome and other concrete fabricators saying, how are you going with like land availability, blah, blah, blah. And one of them actually said we'd jump on that site straight away if they ever left. But we also looked at their profitability anyway. We looked at their P&L statements and they're really profitable. So why would they actually leave? If they were going to leave, it'd be because they need to upgrade the size. But part of the due diligence process was they want to work with us to extend. They don't want to change sites because they're already locked into this site. We're working with them to extend the floor space. So that as a minimum, you'd get them for another 10, 15 years because they're financially going to be inputting money into the build as well. And that's part of the negotiations as a commercial owner. Sometimes the tenant will actually pay for their extensions. And then part of that is important rental concession or something like that. But yeah, so I had the exact same thought on this 1 million. But again, we spoke to two competitors and they were like, no, we can't get land. We jump on that site straight away because it's all DA approved as well for that reason. But even then, the vacancy rate, ignoring the concrete one, because part of the lease, if they leave, they have to take away all the equipment. The vacancy rates we saw are about 6 to 12 months. So if they did leave in 5 or 10 years, not ideal, but hopefully you'd fill it in 6 to 12 months and then you get another tenant for 10, 15 years, for instance. So, but again, that is part of the risk with commercial. Sunshine Coast is a really good location. You can, so to answer your question before. So if you're looking for a smaller one, maybe like a little retail. So this is in Fremantle. This is sub 200K. 7.28% net return.
Yes.
Just ticks the boxes. Medical, it's a dentist, so like fairly stable, you'd assume. We do all the foot traffic analysis and stuff. They're happy, they're profitable, they said, so they're probably not going anywhere for the next 10 years. So that sort of answers the question. The
lower price ones, okay. But can you still get commercial property that cheap in Fremantle these days?
We bought this like 3 months ago, so yes.
3 months ago, okay.
Yeah. This isn't old. This is not that old. We're going into probably about 4 or 5 months ago. This is a very stock standard, these two. So this is like slightly newer property, 6%-ish yield, good depreciation, fresh lease, just like a tick the box type one. This is a really good buy. This is actually one of my favorite buys. We got this about 5 months ago.
Please show us.
Big freestanding site, Dulux, 1.2 mil, very versatile premises. If they ever left, it could be a car mechanic or wholesaler, distributor, fabricator, storage. Like it's quite versatile. It could be a pet barn, like I mentioned before. Like it's got that type of kind of look about it. The benefit of this one and why in the same area of Perth, we could probably normally achieve a 6.5%.
Yeah.
We already got a 6%. First reason was it's freestanding, but the main reason is it's a fresh 7-year lease and they've been there for 24 years. So we're paying a little bit of a premium for the security of like who the tenant is and how long the lease is as well. So there's that. Some other little cheap retail ones. I'm just seeing if there's something a bit more interesting on here for you.
I'm curious about, do you have any example of warehouse that's around 300,000-400,000 like you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, so like here's one here, 6.5% new fund. We'll go to some more recent ones because I can show you what's popped up. Here's one in Brisbane, so 6.06%, 500 grand. There's nothing crazily exciting about these ones. It's just a tick the box. It's a good tenant, good location, decent length lease, low vacancy rate region. For some reason, it's not liking that link. I'll move on to the next one.
Seems like you buy a lot in Brisbane and Perth.
If a lot of my clients come to me because they're chasing yield, they want a 6-7% return. The reason these ones go on, so these are the social media ones. So just for your listeners, these are the ones that grab attention on social media because they are like the high yields. The ones in Sydney and Melbourne, they're 4.5 to 5.5%. They're not really clickbaity type ones, but we're still buying. We buy about 10 a month, and I'd say about 6 or 7 of them are Brisbane or Perth, and then the other 3 are a mix between Sydney, Adelaide, Canberra. I haven't really bought too much in Melbourne in the last 6 months just because the yields are terrible. It's very hard to even get a 5 in front of it.
Yes.
But then I also buy regional. So I'll buy like, if I find something, we bought like a big warehouse in Devonport in Tasmania for a 7.5% net return because it had the X factor of freestanding, high yield. That multi-tenancy one I mentioned before with the 12 tenants, got that in Townsville. So you get those as well. But I'm not limited to any types of properties or locations. It's got to make sense for the client with what they're trying to achieve and the yield and the location. And then we balance the risk versus reward. I don't sugarcoat properties. I'm not a real estate agent. My job is to represent you to get you a good deal. So I present the data, and at least that way you make an informed decision with what you're doing.
Yes, great.
But here's just a little cheapie. It's just a standard warehouse with an office on the side. So there's those types of ones. That's kind of like some sample properties. If any of your listeners want to have a look at some more, just give me a buzz or shoot me an email. I can show you some more. We can jump on a video call and I can run them through the recent 10 purchases through my emails. That's fine as well.
Sure. Finally, I'm just curious because I've been getting some clients complaining, say, I've been purchasing, properties in Sydney, residential property in Sydney and Melbourne, and they are all negative gearing. And now that the interest rate has gone up, it's even more stressful to hold them. Is it the answer to, like, instead of selling off those negative gear properties, is it the answer lies within maybe acquiring commercial property to slowly balance that portfolio back to a not so negative gearing situation. Is that possible or not really?
No, really good question. And I'd say probably 50% of my inquiries and clients are doing exactly that. They own 2 or 3 properties and they're buying commercial, not to necessarily build a passive income now because they're happy with their jobs and their income. It's to offset the negative gearing that they've got just because they're struggling financially to pay it and still enjoy life a little bit. So no, that's a very clear strategy of, cool, how much are we negatively geared? Might be, let's say, 40 grand a year. Cool, let's buy commercial to offset some of that so we get some of that back so we're closer to neutral.
Oh, okay, great. Excellent. Thank you so much, Steve. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, that's fine. If anyone's got any questions, just type in Steve Palise on Google or visit my website, paliseproperty.com, and we'll have a chat after, Lillian. We can get some free books to the clients. I've also got a educational 10-episode podcast series. So if you really want to educate yourself, just listen to those 10 episodes. I go through literally every in and out of commercial property, the pros, the cons, the risks, and at least that way you can make an informed decision. Or if you're interested in using a buyer's agent like me to actually find you a deal, feel free to reach out and we'll have a chat and I can obviously source the property for you.
Great. The 10-step videos you mentioned, is that like you have to pay to do that one?
No, it's all free. Just type in, it's on any podcast streaming service, type in commercial property investing explained. And there's the whole process. And there's like 10 one-hour episodes, and each episode just goes through a different part of commercial. So there'll be it's actually 2 episodes on due diligence, an episode on like lease review, an episode on tenant and business investigations, and it just breaks it down piece by piece. There's no fluff in it. There's no like me talking high level. It's really deep kind of listening. Same as my book. My book's 350 pages on like, this is exactly what you need to cross-check. On my website as well. So any of those spreadsheets I showed you, if you go to the resource section on my website, I've got about 20 different spreadsheets. I've got a due diligence checklist. I've got property plans on there. You can download everything for free. There's no like paying for anything. I give you, my strength comes from I've got so many acquisitions under my belt and I know what I'm doing and I've got good contacts in the industry. All the information is out there to do it yourself. People come to me because they don't want to make a mistake. They want access to off market. They don't have the time, or they just get a good deal. They want someone who knows what they're doing to look after them. So I know where my expertise kind of lies, and that's why I'm obviously running a good business.
Wonderful. Yeah, you sound very professional and experienced.
Thanks, Lillian.
Well, thank you so much for coming to Australian Property Investment Group, the Chinese version. So it's been great for you to come in. I think all the members have learned a lot from you today.
No problem. If you want to add any of my links to social medias and things like that in the group, feel free to add that. And then, people reach out if you've got any questions.
Sure. You mentioned before can get a code to get your book or something, right?
Yeah, I can give you, so the normal free code, if you want to go on my website now, just go to my website and use the code word free book. And then I'll send you guys, or if you let me know a code, if you want me to set up a code called like Lillian, I can put Lillian in, and that way at least I know, oh, cool, they came from your group and I can give them some attention.
Okay, sure. Not a problem. We can work something out like that offline.
Sounds good.
All right. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Lillian. Have a good one.
Have a good